In the shadow-choked corridors of Hampton Court, behind the suffocating tapestries, the king's loins dictated England's destiny. Henry VIII didn't just wreck 6 marriages. He torched centuries of faith, hacked ties with Rome, and scattered heads like rose petals in spring. His bed wasn't just a bed, it was a courtroom, a gallows, a slaughterhouse where wedding vows were rewritten as execution warrants. England's holy altar was reduced to a mattress soaked with sweat and betrayal. God wasn't whispering to Henry. He was screaming, "For Christ's sake, zip it up!" When Henry waddled onto the throne in 1509, he was paraded as a golden prince. 6 feet of muscle, armor clanging, eyes glittering like a Renaissance poster boy. Married to Catherine of Aragon, he looked like chivalry itself had strapped on a codpiece. But beneath the silk and jewels lurked a beast convinced that his wandering manhood was divine proof of kingship. The glittering prince was just a wolf stuffed into velvet. Shakespeare should have skipped Hamlet and written the codpiece that ate England. England back then bowed to Catholic doctrine. Adultery was a sin, marriage was holy, and breaking vows meant eternal damnation. But in Henry's toxic hothouse court, rules melted like wax. Proximity to power was everything, and resisting the king's touch was suicide in pearls. Ladies-in-waiting were bait in a rigged game where honor was punished and compliance bought survival. Every kiss was treasonous, every refusal an invitation to lose your head. At Tudor court, sleeping with power wasn't a metaphor. It was a death sentence wrapped in silk sheets. Other monarchs across Europe kept mistresses with a bit of discretion. Francis I of France at least had the manners to sneak around. But Henry, he swung like a battering ram, parading lovers in front of his wife as if humiliation itself was a royal sport. Catherine of Aragon, noble Spanish queen, was forced to smile as teenage ladies limped out of Henry's chambers jingling with fresh jewels. He weaponized humiliation with the elegance of a butcher sharpening his knife. Imagine your husband cheating on you and handing the mistress your favorite necklace on the way out. Henry's propaganda machine built him up as God's chosen stud. He believed his erections were miracles, proof that heaven itself had blessed his seed. He conquered on the battlefield and in the bed, and if the Pope disagreed, well, clearly Rome was meddling with divine loins. His theology was simple. If he wanted it, it was holy. If anyone denied it, they were heretics begging for the axe. Forget divine right of kings. This was divine right of ding-a-ling. Catherine endured 24 years of slow public crucifixion. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and the sin of getting older became her crimes. Henry's visits dwindled. His mistresses got younger, softer, dumber. The queen was forced to serve tea to her husband's playthings, while her crown corroded under the weight of his contempt. She aged with dignity, and he punished her for it like wrinkles were treason. In Henry's book, crow's feet were more dangerous than rebellion. Enter Elizabeth Blount, Bessie, the first lucky winner of Henry's twisted lottery. She popped out his bastard son in 1519, and Henry almost crowned the boy as heir. He showered the child with titles while Catherine swallowed the insult whole. For Henry it was a divine sign. His sacred seed worked just fine. It was Catherine's womb that had failed. Catherine's humiliation was broadcast like a royal proclamation. The king's penis was healthy, and the queen was defective. The world's first gender reveal party. "It's not me, it's you, honey." Then came Mary Boleyn, sweet, pliant, disposable. She bore him at least one child, maybe 2, but Henry shoved her aside when boredom set in. She was married off to a minor nobody, her bastard babies whispered about but never acknowledged. Mary understood the game. Give pleasure, take gifts, vanish quietly. She was the practice round before the real storm. Mary got jewelry, a husband, and a one-way ticket to irrelevance. Better than a scaffold, I guess. But Anne, Mary's sister, didn't play the role of disposable toy. She knew the pattern: passion, pregnancy, dismissal, exile. So she turned the tables, refused the bed, dangled the bait, and kept Henry panting like a dog for 7 years. She gave him wit, flirtation, glimpses of what he couldn't have. And Henry, swollen with ego, was reduced to begging in letters. Drooling over her breasts he called pretty duckies. For once, the predator was the prey. Nothing's funnier than a king writing love notes that sound like a horny farm boy. By then, Henry's hunger had gone from personal vice to national disaster. To bet Anne, He was ready to tear down Rome itself, burn centuries of tradition, and crown himself God's horny little deputy. His lust wasn't just private filth, it was about to become the blueprint for England's apocalypse. Anne Boleyn wasn't just another skirt to tumble in the hay. She was the queen of slow torture. For 7 damn years, she played Henry like a fiddle strung with his own veins. No bed, no touch, just a taste here and there, enough to keep him sweating and scribbling love notes like a horny schoolboy. In those letters, the mighty king reduced himself to drooling over her pretty duckies, like some farmhand trying to buy milk with compliments. The predator had been declawed, and he didn't even notice. Imagine ruling a kingdom, but begging like a teenage boy who just discovered nipples. Henry's obsession festered into mania. The annulment from Catherine dragged on for 6 years. 6 years of tantrums, violent mood swings, and paranoia that would make a lunatic blush. The king wasn't just horny, he was convinced God himself had tied up his loins and demanded satisfaction. Anyone opposing his remarriage wasn't just political opposition. They were heretics, traitors, enemies of the almighty penis. Forget the Holy Trinity. It was Henry, his codpiece, and God nodding along. When Anne finally gave in and ended up pregnant, Henry detonated Christendom. By 1533, he had bulldozed through Rome, crowned himself head of the Church of England, and declared his old marriage void like ripping up an old grocery list. England wasn't breaking with the Pope for theology. It was breaking for lust, for sweaty desperation, for a son still trapped in Anne's belly. Religion became foreplay, law became Viagra, and the kingdom became collateral damage. England didn't get a reformation, it got a royal booty call gone global. Anne strutted into the role of queen, but her throne was nailed to a guillotine. Henry had gotten what he wanted, which meant she was already on borrowed time. The baby bump he bragged about spat out Elizabeth, a daughter, not the golden son he'd promised the heavens. The king's passion, which had once burned like wildfire, now fizzled into the usual Tudor boredom. And when Henry got bored, heads rolled. Congratulations, Anne. You gave birth to the wrong chromosome. Pack your bag or your neck. While Anne tried to hold his attention, Henry's eyes were already crawling up Jane Seymour's skirts, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. History repeated itself like a bad joke, but this time the punchline was fatal. Catherine had been Spanish royalty. She could be divorced. Anne had no powerful protectors, no foreign armies waiting to avenge her. She had climbed too high, pissed off too many, and now the king's lust curdled into disgust. Divorce wouldn't be enough. No, she had to be annihilated. In Henry's court, "Till death do us part" wasn't a vow. It was a damn prophecy. The charges leveled against Anne were so absurd they'd make a drunk priest blush. Adultery with 5 men, incest with her brother, conspiracies whispered in bedsheets. Henry didn't just want her gone, he wanted her erased. The trial was theater, a grotesque farce where guilt was predetermined and evidence was as real as unicorn piss. Anne, who had once dangled him like a puppet, was now branded a slut, a witch, a whore who had bewitched England's golden king. Henry didn't just break up, he nuked the ex and salted the earth. Her execution in 1536 turned the scaffold into a sermon. The message was clear. The king's lust could crown you, but his disgust could butcher you. Every woman in England learned the lesson. Play the game, smile at the monster, and pray your womb popped out a boy before his temper popped off your head. The Tudor dating app had only 2 options, queen or corpse. Anne's blood wasn't even dry before Jane Seymour was in Henry's arms, belly swelling with the much-hyped savior of the dynasty. But Jane's victory lasted 12 days after childbirth, before death claimed her. Henry grieved, sure, but grief didn't stop him from shopping for wife number 4 like a man hunting at a meat market. Mourning in Tudor England was just foreplay for the next marriage contract. Henry's Tinder bio would have read, "Looking for love, must love executioners." By the time Jane Seymour's corpse cooled, Henry's advisors were already hawking him around the European marriage market like a bloated prize pig. Enter Anne of Cleves, the poor German princess sold to him through a flattering portrait. When she arrived in England, Henry took one look and spat out the immortal insult, "Unbibly ugly." His lust evaporated faster than holy water on a bonfire, and suddenly Europe was laughing at the fat tyrant who couldn't even get it up for his political bride. The marriage was annulled, but the humiliation was eternal. Imagine being rejected by a man with a pus-dripping leg and a face like spoiled ham. Henry's tantrum about Anne of Cleves wasn't just personal, it was a state affair. Courtiers, physicians, and priests were dragged into the royal bedroom to debate the king's performance. A nation's politics boiled down to one question: could Henry get it up or not? England wasn't governed by Parliament or God anymore. It was governed by a royal crotch that needed a doctor's note. Forget Magna Carta. Welcome to the age of Magna Erectile Dysfunction. While Anne was quietly shuffled off with the generous title of King's beloved sister, Henry's rotting eyes locked onto Catherine Howard, Anne Boleyn's teenage cousin. She was no more than 15, maybe younger, when she was paraded into the tyrant's path like a sacrificial lamb. The Howard family, hungry for influence, shoved their child forward, effectively gift-wrapping her for a man old enough to be her grandfather, fat enough to be her coffin. Nothing says family values like pimping out your niece to an obese tyrant with a festering leg. Catherine Howard's tragedy was written before it began. She had already been abused by older men before Henry, primed for exploitation. Now she was shoved into the role of blushing bride, forced to stroke the ego of a king who smelled of rot and desperation. She giggled on command, smiled through terror, and played the role of Rose without a thorn while silently drowning in fear. Imagine being called Rose without a thorn by a man who smelled like a butcher's bin left in July. Henry, delusional to the core, believed the teenager genuinely desired him. He pranced about, showering her with jewels, convinced this terrified girl was proof of his undying virility. His fantasy blinded him to the truth, that Catherine was trapped, coerced, and sickened by the reality of her marriage. The king wasn't just lustful, he was hallucinating. When your midlife crisis is marrying a teenager, therapy might have been cheaper than executions. But secrets never stayed buried at Tudor court. Whispers of Catherine's past love surfaced, men who had touched her long before the king. Today we'd call it child abuse. Back then, Henry called it treason. His fragile delusion cracked, and the wrath was volcanic. He couldn't bear the idea that his perfect Rose had once been in another man's hands. So like Anne before her, Catherine was marched to the block. Henry's idea of moving on was switching from wedding ring to axe handle. The girl rehearsed laying her head on the scaffold, 15 going on corpse. She died young, terrified, yet dignified, a child sacrificed on the altar of Henry's insecurities. Beside her stood Jane Boleyn, Anne's old enemy turned accomplice, dragged into the slaughterhouse too. Even helping Henry wasn't a guarantee of survival. Everyone was disposable in his grotesque bedroom monarchy. In Henry's world, loyalty was like foreplay, fun until the axe drops. By now, the court was gagging on fear. Each new queen was a dice roll, and the losers didn't just leave, they bled. Catherine Howard's death was the shriek of a system rotting from within, where lust, paranoia, and absolute power fused into one monstrous ritual of sacrifice. Henry wasn't a husband anymore. He was a butcher running a bridal abattoir. The only safe marital status under Henry VIII? Dead before he noticed you. By the time Henry lurched into marriage with Catherine Parr in 1543, his body was collapsing under the weight of its own rot. 400 pounds of wheezing tyranny, leg ulcers oozing pus like fountains of filth, diabetes gnawing at him. Yet the beast still demanded a queen. Catherine didn't marry a man. She married a festering corpse with a crown glued on top. Her role wasn't lover or partner. It was nurse, mother, hostage. Imagine spoon-feeding porridge to Jabba the Hutt and calling it romance. Even so, Catherine Parr lived in constant terror. She'd watch Catherine of Aragon exiled, Anne Boleyn decapitated, Jane Seymour die in childbirth, Anne of Cleves humiliated, and Catherine Howard butchered. She knew exactly what happened to queens who misplaced a word, a smile, or a womb. Every kiss, every prayer at Henry's bedside was survival strategy. She stroked his ego, dabbed at his wounds, and swallowed her fear. It wasn't marriage, it was hostage negotiations. Catherine Parr didn't marry Henry. She negotiated her own ransom with God as witness. Henry, even in his bloated decay, refused to believe his libido was dying. He demanded proof of virility, as if a wheezing invalid with a leg that stank of death could still inspire teenage passion. Every groan of pain he twisted into proof of manhood. Catherine endured his fumbling attempts at intimacy like a soldier in a trench, praying for it to end before the infection spread. Nothing says romance like dodging bed sores and wheezy thrusts from a dying tyrant. But even Catherine nearly didn't make it. Her Protestant opinions once angered Henry enough to spark whispers of heresy. And in Tudor England, heresy meant firewood. The Queen of England was nearly reduced to ash because she dared open her mouth about religion in a palace built on corpses. She survived only by groveling, flattering the king's ego, and pretending her words had been misunderstood. Her survival wasn't luck, it was theater. She didn't just dodge an axe, she dodged a bonfire with a curtsy. Meanwhile, the machinery of Henry's lust extended far beyond his wives. Servants, maids, nameless women, each forced to bend beneath the weight of his appetites. Families shoved daughters into his path, hoping for advancement and praying for survival. The lucky ones were bought off with jewels and silence. The unlucky ones disappeared, erased, their suffering whispered but never recorded. Every corridor of Hampton Court was soaked in invisible screams. The king's bed wasn't just furniture, it was a meat grinder with silk sheets. Henry's delusion was complete. As head of the church, he rewrote divine law to justify every grope, every execution, every sham marriage. What was adultery for the rest of England was God's will when it came from the king's loins. Priests bent their spines into pretzels to defend him, burning dissenters alive while blessing his lust as holy. It wasn't religion anymore. It was pornography masquerading as theology. Forget the 10 Commandments. Henry lived by one rule. Thou shalt not cock-block the king. And yet, for all the blood spilled, all the women destroyed, all the crowns stained with executioner's sweat, Henry's great obsession failed him. He wanted sons, heirs, immortality through his sacred seed. What he got was one sickly boy, Edward VI, who coughed himself into an early grave, and 2 bastardized daughters he'd once spat on, who outlived him and wore the crown. All his cruelty, all his divine will, and in the end, it was women who carried England. 6 wives, thousands of corpses, rivers of blood, and the throne still went to the daughters he tried to erase. By the time Henry finally rotted into his grave in 1547, there was no redemption, no repentance, no recognition of the horrors he'd unleashed. He believed to the last wheezing breath that God had sanctioned his lust, his murders, his divine penis. He died not as a king, not even as a man, but as a bloated tyrant convinced his rot smelled like incense. Henry didn't meet God. He probably slipped straight into hell and asked for a fresh wife. Henry's corpse may have gone into the ground in 1547, but his stench still ruled England. The Church of England, born not from faith but from his sweaty desperation, was his permanent bastard child. Generations of war, division, and paranoia sprouted from the king's groin like weeds choking the kingdom. Every priest, every lawmaker, every trembling courtier had been forced to bend under the tyranny of a codpiece, and the scars didn't fade just because the monster stopped breathing. England didn't inherit a legacy. It inherited a venereal disease with a crown. His children were shattered relics of his obsessions. Mary Tudor grew up watching her mother publicly humiliated until the hatred calcified in her veins. Elizabeth, whose mother was executed before she was 3, learned that marriage wasn't a partnership but a death sentence. Edward, the precious boy, the longed-for heir, died coughing at 15, proving that Henry's divine seed was nothing but cheap wine poured into a cracked cup. All that blood spilled for heirs, and the heir croaked before he could even grow a beard. Mary turned her bitterness into fire, burning Protestants alive to avenge her mother. Elizabeth turned her father's trauma into armor, ruling unmarried forever the Virgin Queen, a title that was really just Tudor code for not stupid enough to end up like mom. Even Edward, sheltered prince though he was, witnessed his father treat women like cattle bound for slaughter. Their childhoods weren't fairy tales. They were morgues with crowns. Disney could never make this story unless Cinderella lost her head at midnight. Outside the palace walls, noble families were ruined by Henry's appetites. Daughters were groomed like lambs for slaughter, brothers testified against sisters, fathers bartered their children to buy a few crumbs of royal favor. The Howards, the Boleyns, the Seymours, entire dynasties chewed up and spat out in the grinder of lust. No family tree survived without a few bloody stumps. The Tudors didn't prune the family tree. They took a chainsaw to it. Europe, too, recoiled in horror. Spain never forgave the insult to Catherine of Aragon. Germany smirked at the disaster of Anne of Cleves. Catholic Europe saw England as a madhouse where queens were beheaded like chickens, and the king crowned himself God's sex rep on earth. Diplomats sent reports dripping with disbelief. The English throne wasn't a monarchy. It was a slaughterhouse run by a butcher in tights. Forget Game of Thrones. This was Game of Codpieces and everyone lost. The law twisted itself into a carnival mirror under Henry's reign. Treason expanded to include adultery, meaning any wife who disappointed him could be legally slaughtered. Succession acts rewrote children's legitimacy like scribbles on parchment. One day bastard, the next day heir. Justice wasn't blind. It was gagged, whipped, and forced to kneel in the royal bedchamber. English law didn't wear a wig in Henry's day. It wore a leash and called him master. Even death didn't silence him. Henry was buried beside Jane Seymour, the one wife who had given him a son, leaving the others scattered, discarded, erased. His will was a sick joke. He asked for masses to be sung for his soul, forgetting he had destroyed the very church that would have done it. The irony dripped thicker than his infected leg wounds. Imagine burning down the church, then asking the ashes to pray for you. The ghosts stayed behind. Hampton Court echoed with the screams of Catherine Howard, running down hallways before the guards dragged her back to the block. The Tower of London became a carnival of death tourism, where visitors gawked at the spot Anne Boleyn's head hit the straw. The palaces weren't monuments. They were mausoleums built from the bones of women. Tudor castles weren't haunted by ghosts. They were haunted by Henry's libido. Henry's death didn't end his tyranny. It just turned it into tradition. The Tudors left behind more than castles and portraits. They left a kingdom where law, religion, and even architecture bent to one man's lust. Monasteries dissolved, families ruined, daughters pimped, priests burned, all because one bloated tyrant confused his groin with God's will. England didn't heal. It limped forward, scarred, paranoid, and permanently rewired by a pervert with a scepter. The Reformation wasn't sparked by faith. It was sparked by a royal itch that wouldn't quit. Even centuries later, his legacy dripped like poison into English life. Elizabeth's virginity cult was nothing more than the backlash to Daddy's slaughterhouse marriages. The Stuarts inherited a throne already cracked by divorce and paranoia. Every royal scandal afterward was judged by one standard. At least it's not Henry VIII. Imagine being remembered not as a king, but as history's worst measuring stick for marital disaster. Henry wasn't just a king. He was the original "don't be like this guy." The legal wreckage was staggering. Treason became a bedroom crime. Succession was a child's game of bastard, legitimate flip-flop, depending on who'd last warmed the king's bed. Laws bent and snapped, proving that in England, justice wasn't blind. It was bent over, gagged, and forced to moan, "Yes, your majesty." Courts weren't courts. They were stage sets for execution dramas starring whichever woman Henry hated that week. Henry turned the courtroom into Pornhub with an axe. Economically, his lust bankrupted monasteries, drained coffers, and redistributed wealth by sheer tantrum. Families were elevated one night, gutted the next, fortunes seized and handed out like party favors after a drunken orgy. England's economy wasn't driven by trade or policy. It was powered by a king's erection. The stock market had bulls and bears. Tudor England had boners and beheadings. Even education wasn't spared. Universities turned from theology and classics to churning out lawyers who could legally explain why adultery was holy if Henry did it. The Bible was twisted like a cheap rag to justify whatever queen he dragged into bed. Students didn't study truth. They studied excuses. Henry didn't create a reformation. He created a curriculum in sexual apologetics. Forget Shakespeare. Henry's greatest contribution to English literature was horny legal fanfiction. The cultural memory rotted into archetypes: the lustful tyrant, the disposable queen, the scheming family pushing daughters into the fire. These weren't myths. They were coping mechanisms, England's way of turning trauma into rhyme. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Nursery rhymes about butchered women, history reduced to a playground chant. That's Henry's true legacy. Murder packaged as folklore. Only Henry could turn serial spousal homicide into a kid's sing-along. And the ghosts, always the ghosts. Palaces haunted, portraits defaced, jewels recycled from one doomed wife to the next. Every stone at Hampton Court reeked of desperation. Every shadow at the Tower whispered betrayal. Tourists now stroll through as if it's quaint, sipping tea where women once screamed. Heritage sanitized the horror, selling Henry as a colorful character instead of a monster with a state-sanctioned harem. History painted him in gold, but underneath it was just blood and pus. The ultimate tragedy? None of it mattered. All the wives butchered, all the daughters bartered, all the laws twisted and throats slit. And England's future rested on the very women he tried to erase. Mary ruled, Elizabeth ruled. His one sickly son coughed out early, and his dynasty died with him. Henry destroyed a nation, chasing immortality through his loins, but his seed only planted chaos. 6 wives, thousands of corpses, one bloated king, and in the end, the sperm lost.